All right, so last video, we were able to create the client and the server projects. We created the GitHub, uploaded them to GitHub, and then we had the server and the client connect to each other. If you haven't seen it, check out the playlist. You can watch this in order. It's actually much more useful like that. And yeah, let's just get going. Let's go straight in. So where we left off last video was the server and the client. We got these connection messages. They were perfect. It was ready to go. And so now we're ready to start, going a little deeper into it. So first I'm going to open up the client, and just, so we don't have to deal with that connect, automatic connect. We want to be able to sign in and have a connect button. Let's create a connect button and then have that called connect. So first let's create a connect button. So I'm going to create an empty. I'm just going to split this off as well. I don't remember how many I had, but it's fine. And under this, we're going to create a canvas, and we're going to call it, main UI. That's fine. Then we're going to create underneath that, we're going to create an image, and we'll call that, background. That's fine. Here you'll see we have our image. I'm just going to keep my, aspect max, and we're going to stretch that out. And that's a little bit too bright for me. So I'm just going to change the color to be something a little softer. That's good. In this, we're going to want to create a vertical layout group, right? So we want to be able to line up our buttons. And so let's go here. Underneath this background, we're going to create a button, an input field, and a button. So let's do input field, add our TMP essentials that we need. Okay, that's good. So we have our input field, which should be in the vertical layout group, which we forgot to set to middle center. There we go. And then we want to create a button. So let's create a button. And it's a little bit it's a little spaced out. Let's call this button connect. And we'll call this input username. All right. And here we'll just, fix what we got here. So change the height. Let's get the spacing to like what, 20, 25 or something like that. All right. I'm very particular, when it comes to creating your, everything looking nice. So let's go here and, let's change this input to be like 350. A little taller, let's make it like 50 high, get it a little bit bigger. And then in the button connect, we'll do the same kind of thing. We'll make it 50. And yeah, that's good. And here we want to have some placeholder text, right? So we have the placeholder text. Let's call it username. Looks like our object reference is not set to an instance of an object on our on here, which is very weird. So let's just delete that and bring it back. Seems like we had a little glitch. There we go. So let's put that on top. Okay. And we'll change that to, what was that? 350 or something, and 50, I think is what I did. All right. Here we're going to change the font size to be like 30. We will go to both of these and we'll make it centered in the middle there. On the placeholder text, we can change this to username. And we go, and then in the button, we'll change the text to connect. That's good. We can make that like 30 as well. Make it nice and big. All right, so now that we have this, we can create another script. I'll create a folder. I'll call it game. Then I'll create another folder in here, and we'll call it UI. And I'll just pop in a UI manager. I like to have managing classes. I know it's a little bit segmented, but keeps everything in my head, squared away. So we're just going to do a singleton UI manager the same way. If it's red, the drill, Alt Enter to bring that up. Now we have our nice UI manager class. We're going to create a public void connect, and we'll have that take in. Well, it doesn't need to take in anything. We'll be good. Now back at our network manager, we'll get rid of this connect call so we can, call it from here. And when you click connect, right now we'll just test, network manager.instance.connect. So it's going to call this connect function as soon as we click the button. So let's test it out. So start the server and start the client. Oh, we forgot to hook up the buttons. So don't forget to hook up the buttons. Go click on your button. We have to create a UI manager empty object. So let's do that. UI manager, drag that on, make it a prefab, put it in our managers thing, and just drag it up here in our managers section. On the button, we're just going to literally, go here, on click, put UI manager and connect. There's that. All right, so now connect, client connected successfully. Our button works. We can close that out. Next, we're gonna go into our network manager and in the client and add, a little bit on here. So there's a callback that happens when you connect. So we're gonna subscribe to that when we create our client. It's client.connected. And then we're gonna subscribe to that and we'll call it on client connected. All right, we just have to create that method, which right now it's doing nothing, that's fine. But remember, this is just something that I've seen a lot, and what needs to happen is, when you subscribe to something, it's always good practice to unsubscribe from it, right? So let's do client.connected minus equals on client connected, right? So now we subscribe to it, we unsubscribe from it. Looks like we have already on destroy doing something, so let's override that and get the base on destroy in there. So now we're good. All right, so now let's go back into the client and let's create a couple more scripts. So we're gonna go into game, create another folder called players, player. We'll create a C# script called player, and then also one called player manager. When it loads, player manager. All right, let's create a prefab for our player. So let's go create empty, call it player. We can actually call it player prefab, that's probably better. And we'll add the player class to that. In our prefabs, we can create another folder called player and drag our little boy there. We can delete him out of the scene and we're gone. Now in our UI folder, we want to be able to access this input field, but I also don't want to make the UI manager dependent on this single input field. It'll be null forever as soon as we leave this login screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to contain that in a separate component and then be able to access that from the UI manager. So let's create a couple more scripts. We'll call this local scene UI, and we'll create another one. We'll call it UI component. Oh, if you load, UI component. All right, so we have a couple classes there. Let's create a new game object here. We'll call this local scene UI. We're going to add that on here. That's just going to go underneath the UI right here, and we'll be able to, add whatever we need to. All right, so first let's create our UI component. So the way that I'm structuring this is I'm going to take a UI component and I'm going to add it to a dictionary. So it's easier to access to an extent, right? It's very debatable how you do this, but this is the way I chose to do it. So let's go public string key. We're going to have our key, and then we'll create more classes under this. So we'll create a button component, which comes from UI component, and there's that. And then we'll create a input component, which comes from UI component as well. All right, and we'll just add serializable to these, to both of these here. And the button component, we're gonna just give it, a button. So Unity Engine UI button. And then input component, we're gonna pass it an input. TMP input, I think is what it is. Yep, TMP input, we'll call this input. And there we go. So we have this, serializable, we're ready to go. Now we're going to create the local scene UI. So let's go to here, let's open it up. And in here, we're gonna create an init function, which initializes our UI. So we'll do private void init and not any of this nonsense. We have our own init. And in this init, we're going to obviously add everything to our dictionary by the key value. So what we want is a list of our buttons. So we'll do a private list of button components, which is what we just created, right? And we'll call this M buttons. There we go. We'll do the same thing for our input components. And we'll call that M inputs. And that's an input component type. And we'll create a dictionary. So we'll say private dictionary string and basically just a UI component. So the parent class of this, and we'll call this M components. That's going to equal a new dictionary string UI component, and then we'll create a public getter version of this. So we'll do public dictionary string UI components, and that just gets our components. And now in the initialize function, we're going to want to create a for each for each button. So we'll say for each button in buttons, let's add it to the dictionary. So we'll say mComponents dot add button dot key and then button. And then the same thing. We don't need this curly braces here. And then for each var input in minputs, we're going to mComponents.add input.key and input. There we go, that easy. Now we're gonna need a way for the UI manager to know which one it has. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set this equal to a variable on the UI manager that just initializes at the beginning of the scene. So let's just say UI manager.instance.local UI equals this. Now, what this is doing here is setting the local UI on the UI manager variable to this. So our intention is to have one of these per scene, right? Not necessarily the same one across the scene. So what you could technically do, right, is make this into a singleton. But the issue is it's going to be a little bit confusing when you have multiple of these switching back and forth among all these scenes. So that's why I wanted to make it not a singleton, but instead accessing a variable on our singleton UI manager and just setting it equal to it. We could probably do a null check for this, and if it's not null, throw some kind of error. But we'll face that if we need to. It's not a big deal. All right, so now let's do a start. On start, we'll call init. Oop, just called something here. All right. So now we need a local UI in our UI manager. So let's just add that really quick. So we'll say public load scene UI is equal to local UI. Oh, well, I called it load scene UI when it's local scene UI. There we go. All right, perfect. So now we're gonna kind of access this in the UI manager to be able to get our username, and when we connect, we'll be able to pass it through. So let's go if local UI is equal to null. We're just gonna pass an error. We'll say no local UI on this scene. We'll return so we don't get confused here. String we're gonna call connect input, and remember now, so we can access that dictionary, we need a key. So we're gonna make our key here. We'll just call it connect input there, and then we can access it, right? So we'll say if local UI dot components dot try get value connect input, which is our key, and we're going to out UI component, and it's called component. Sure, basically if this is true, it'll output a component that's not null, but it'll also return bool, so we can check if this is not true, then we can do something. So we'll say debug.log error, and we'll just do like a little log to let us know what's happening. So no input component found, and then we can put connect input as our key, and then we'll return. So if this doesn't return and it gets all the way here, now we can finally do what we want here. So we'll do input component, and we'll call it input. We're just going to cast this component to an input component because we know that's what it is because we put the key, right? Now we take our username, which is going to be the text from our input component. So we'll say input.input.text, right? And we could just pass that username into this connect method. And when we connect, we'll use that. And we'll get back to this. Now we're just gonna go into our player manager and kind of create that out. Now I know this is a lot of setup, guys, but it's really worth it to get everything working and stable. It's really useful to do that. So we're gonna do singleton player manager. All right, and let's just, whatever, we'll delete that, that's fine. We need a dictionary. So let's do a private static dictionary, which will hold our player's ID and the player itself. We'll call this M players. We can call it S players for static, right? Equals new dictionary. Then we will do, we want a way to be able to get a player from here. So we'll do a public static player, get player, and we'll pass in a ushort ID. And all we're gonna do is we're going to return a value, right? So we could return from there, but it's always better to do when you do have dictionaries, you do a try get, so you don't throw, crazy errors. So we'll say if, s players dot try get value ID, and then out player player. Either way, it's going to return null, right? So we really don't need that. It's just going to try to get it. That's fine. And if it can't find it, it's going to return. We're just going to return our null if it's there, but at least it's not going to throw us some error. So that's a good way with dictionaries, is to try get value as much as possible. We're going to need a way to remove a player. So let's do a public static and then a bool, right? So we can see if the player is actually removed or not. Let's do a remove player. Let's pass in an ID. And then we'll say the same kind of thing. We'll say if splayers.tryGetValue ID out player player. But this time we're just going to, if it's true, we're going to remove. So remove ID from there, and then we'll return true. And if it doesn't work, then we're going to return false, right? So that's also another way to catch it. We are going to probably want to reference to our local player. So let's create a public player, local player, which just gets the player with the ID that is passed from the network manager. So there's network manager.instance.client.id will pass our local ID. That's the one that happens when you click connect, you'll get that ID. Now we'll do a public bool is local player, where we pass in a ushort ID, and literally that's just going to say is the ID equal to the local player dot ID. I think any of these that are accessing here, we can just make them static. That's probably a good way to go here. Get instance ID is not what we want. We'll do local player dot ID, which we haven't created yet. Then we're going to do public void spawn initial player, which is what we're going to want to do as soon as we spawn. We're going to want to create kind of an empty player, right? So we're going to create a new player, which instantiates our player prefab. So we need to create a player prefab. Let's do that. We're going to do a serialized field private game object, and that's going to be mPlayer prefab. But a lot of times with this, I want it to be static, so it kind of persists throughout the scene changes. So we'll just do a private static game object, and that'll be, call it sPlayer prefab, right? And then on awake, so we can do this underneath all this local player stuff, since that's all together, we can do a protected override void awake. We're gonna get the base awake, and then we'll set sPlayer prefab equal to mPlayer prefab. That way we have our static variable set, and we'll just instantiate from here. So we'll say sPlayer prefab, and we'll do vector3.0 and quaternion.identity. So just default everything, because it's not really a real thing. And then we're going to need to get the component of player from there. So now we have our player. Easy. We're going to change our player's name while we wait for the server to get back to us, right? It's going to be our username, which we need to pass as a parameter. We're going to use our username, and we'll just say local player, and then we'll say waiting for server. That way, we know we're created. We're just creating this guy, and we send out a ping to the server, and we're going to come back, and we'll change it when we get back. So we kind of know what's going on visually. All right, we're going to get his ID. So we have ushort ID, which is that same thing we created before. So it's network manager.instance.client.id. This is then we have player.init, and we're going to init with the username right here, and we're going to say ID. And that should initialize our guy. We have to create that method, and then we're going to add our guy to our dictionary. So we'll do splayers.add ID player. Right, that's that easy. And then we're going to send something to the server that says, are we allowed to spawn? Basically, this is here right now. So this part that I'm creating right now is not really required at this point, right? Because we're not really doing any validation. But it will come in handy when it's time to sign in with a login or something like that. So we're just creating it now for the future to get this going, right? All right, and let's go create the player script and add all this good stuff there. So let's go to our player script, and we'll add what we need to add. So we need a public ushort ID, right? And that's going to be a get private set. We're going to do a public string. username, which will be a get private set. And we'll do a public bool is local just to see if we're the local player. Basically, all of these we're not going to need to set anywhere else because we're going to create an init function right here, which is going to take in a ushort ID, a string username, and a bool is local. What we'll do lowercase there. All right, and we'll just literally set ID equals ID, username equals username, and is local equals is local. Perfect. All right, and on this guy, we're going to actually go back to our player manager and see how we only passed in two parameters. Let's pass in true, because this guy is our local guy, right? Oh, not here. Here, true. There we go. So now our init function is good. Player done. Oh, I think I made this private. That is supposed to be a public boy. All right. So now we got our public little initialize, which is kind of like constructor. We got, ID here, username here. All right. Now we're initialized. Now we have to go back in here and let's say, let's make sure that on destroy. So let's do a private void on destroy. And let's just remove him from the list if we get destroyed. So let's do player manager dot remove player, and we'll put ID here. And then now we're gonna have like our little message sending thing, right? So the way that messages work is basically we use an enum to send in the messages. So let's go to network manager and we're going to public enum and we're gonna say server to client message, and that's a ushort enum. And then the same thing, public enum client to server message, and that's also a ushort enum. And so this gives us a good way to give us some visual commands here for this digit. So let's think. What do we need? So we're gonna send we're gonna request a login, right? On this guy, and then on the server, when the server receives it, we're gonna approve the login request, right? Or deny it. So we'll say approve login. Okay. So that's it. That's easy. So now we can get to sending the message. All right. And I don't know what happened here, but let's fix that. All right. So now we're going to finish this. So we're going to basically send a message. So let's go to region messages. So we're just going to create a little message region here. So we can, keep track of what's going on. We can always collapse it if we want to, give some space, let everyone know here that we're, sending messages. Message sending, just a good thing that I like to do to kind of keep organized there. And so now we'll do the message. So we have that request init function that we created. So we do request init. And in that, we're going to create a new message, which is message.create. The message class is from Riptide, right? You see how it started using Riptide? This is a Riptide message. So this is exactly like packaging the different bytes together to be able to send the message to the server. So it takes in a message send mode, which is an enum that he provided. We're going to use reliable because we want this to get there. And then the enum ID, which is the ID we created, which is the client to server message, and that is request login, right? On this, we're going to add our username as a bit. So with this, you can just add different kinds of variables to pass messages and data to the server, right? So there's one called add string. With that, we're going to pass in our username, and then we're going to send it, right? So sending is really easy. You just type in network manager.instance.server or .client.send. We're on the client. And there's that. That's sent. So one more thing before, we finish is we created this spawn initial player, but we never called it anywhere. So the idea that I had was to call it as soon as we have the on client connected function, right? That's why we created that, is so as soon as the client is connected and we get the go ahead, we're going to spawn the player and send the request to actually log in, right? So we're going to do player manager.instance.spawn initial player, and then we're going to pass in the username. But how can we do that? Well, we have to create a variable for the username, right? So on connect, we're going to pass in the username from here. So we'll say string username, and we're going to have to save that as a variable. I like to save it as a static variable. So let's go over here, and we'll just say private static string s local username. There we go. And we're just gonna, as soon as we get that username, we're going to say s local username is equal to, and then we'll do like a little check here. So we'll say string dot is null or empty. We're going to pass in our username. If it is null or empty, then we're just going to call ourselves like guest, right? Otherwise, we're going to use our username. So now that we have that, we can pass that in here. And there's that. So now we're connected. As soon as we're connected, we're going to spawn this initial player, and then we're going to send a request to the server. But right now, that request goes nowhere, right? So now it's time to go to the server and actually receive that request and manage it and do what we got to do to, get it working. So the easy way to do this, right? I already showed you, since we're going to be creating a lot of these things again, we're going to create a package, right? So let's go back and let's create a package. So export package. We want the prefabs that we have here. Let's say we don't need the manager one since we have separate manager scripts. We don't need the scenes, but we want all the game ones. We want the UI ones, and the multiplayer we don't need, and the net and the utils we don't need, right? The settings we don't need, the text mesh pro we don't need, and that. So really what we're looking for is the scripts, all the player scripts, and none of the UI scripts. We actually don't need any UI, right? Because that's on the other side. So really just the player scripts. That's all we're sending over, and the player prefab. So let's export that. We can just overwrite whatever we just had. So that's just a transfer package. Go to our server, open that up, take what we want, and here we go. We're in. We have all of these errors because we're doing client instead of server. So let's go fix these errors as we need to. So we don't need any local players on here. So we're in the player manager. We don't need local players. All right, we still want to get players. We still want to remove players. But here we can just kind of remove that because we're not spawning anyone, right? So let's see what other errors we have. Client to server message does not exist. So actually that's a good thing, is now we can go to our network manager, go to this one here, take this enum that we created on the client, copy it, and then paste it at the top of the network manager of the server. Now we have identical enums. So that should fix one of those errors. And I think I saw here instead of network manager. So we just want to get rid of this init function here. So there's that, and that should, perfect. And so now we need to receive the message, right? So we sent the message here on the player, right? We sent the message with this enum. So now to receive the message, basically all you got to do is we're going to go to the player manager. We're going to copy this little thing here because I like the organization. We're going to do message receiving, and we will receive the message. So the way you receive a message is called message handler. Then in parentheses, you have to cast your enum to a ushort. We put client to server ID, so the one that we're actually receiving. We put that up here, and the method underneath this will be the receiver. So the thing about message receiving is you have to do a static method. So we're going to just private static void, and we'll do receive login request. It's going to take in whoever it sent it, so a ushort from ID and a message, right? And so now we can read that message. So all we sent in that message was the username, so we're just going to get that. So it's literally to read from the message, make sure that you're reading in the order that you sent it, right? Luckily this time we're only sending one thing, so you can't really mess it up. But if you send like an ID and then a username and then an ID, you can't read it username, ID, ID. You have to go in the same order you sent it. So ID, username, ID, right? So this one's easy. This one's just a string. So we're going to do get string. Now we have our string. Easy. And now we'll do like a spawn player method, and we'll pass in the from ID and the username. And here, instead of this, we can just delete that. We don't need that. We'll do a private static void spawn player, right? And the reason that we're doing it private static is because this is private static. In order to call a method from if it's in the same class, it's got to be static as well. So that's going to take in a ushort ID and a string username, right? And so basically all we're going to do here is, kind of a similar thing. We're going to instantiate the player. So instantiate sPlayer prefab at 0 and 0. All right, and then we are going to create a name here. And we'll say, just very simple, like a username and the ID. That's pretty simple. And then we'll call init. So player.init, where we pass in our ID, username, and actually we don't need isLocal, so we'll leave that out. We'll fix that in a second. And we're gonna add them to our list. So we'll say splayers.add, what is it? ID player. Yeah, then we'll just send back, we'll say player.approve login, right? So we're gonna have to approve the login. It's good to call from there. Oh, we forgot to get component player here. All right, there's that. And now on the player, we're going to want to remove the isLocal because this is on the server. We don't need to know who's local or not, and no one's gonna be local. All right, and then we had that sending message, right? It was login approved, right? So we're gonna do public void login approved. And that's gonna be a message again. And message.create, and we'll send it reliable as well because we want to definitely get it right. And we do server to client message, and that is approve login. There we go. So basically, ideally, you would go here and send a bool. So let's just say, approve is equal to true, whatever, because we don't really care. But then you send that over to send it from the server. Now we just do network manager.instance.server.send. And then we send the message and then the to ID, right? So the ID would literally be this because it's our local. We only want it sent to one guy. We're just sending it to the guy basically the same guy that sent us the first request is getting it back, right? That easy. So now let's just see if we have any errors. Here's an error right here. Does not contain okay, there we go. Login approved, now it's approved login. That should fix that error. All right, there we go. Variable approve is assigned but never used. Okay, yeah, so what I forgot to do is add this to the message. So let's just add this. So we'll say message.add bool approve. That easy. Now we're sending the message back. You don't necessarily have to assign anything to a message, right? And ideally at this point, we don't have any reason to, but eventually, right, we're gonna validate it and things like that. So it's always good, to send a message of approval or denial, right? So here it's gonna be true. If we really wanted to be good, we'd say approve. And then here we'll literally just pass that in. And here we'll say, should we approve, right? So we'll say bool should approve. This is in the player manager. So should approve equals true. We're just pass that in, but here it could be anything, right? So could be validation from database or something, right? There's that. And so now we sent the message. So we got to receive it, right? Anytime you send a message, you have to receive it. So we go back to the client. And we're here, and the player manager is where I like to receive these messages. So let's go back here, copy this. Now we're back in the client player manager. Create a little message section here. All right, we'll do message receive. Okay, and we can get rid of that. And just becomes, second nature, right? So you need a message handler. You're gonna take a ushort of whatever our message enum was, which is server to client message, and that was approved login. Now we do a private static void receive login approve, or let's do receive approve login. With this one, we're not getting back an ID, we're just getting a message, right? So we'll get a message, and we just have to read from the message, which had a bool, right? So we're gonna say bool approve is equal to message.getBool. It's that easy. And then we do, some kind of login, right? So we'll just call this initialize. We'll say if approve, then we're going to initialize our local player, right? That easy. So now we just have to create a method called initialize local player. So, as you can see, this is a lot of bouncing back and forth, right? And it takes a lot of time to get right and get done. But once we get it done, it all becomes pretty straightforward. This is kind of laying the framework for it. So let's create this method here. So right underneath our spawn player, we can do a private static void initialize local player, which we just, we already have our local player. So let's just change his name like we did right here. We'll just change it to local player.username, and then the 2 hyphens, and we'll call it local player.id. And then we'll just do one more and we'll call it local. That's fine. That's it. So that's how we get our local player, good to go. So, I mean, let's see if this works. So now we go and test, make sure we have no errors. Oh, and actually before I forget, we never added our local scene UI. We need our input to this local scene UI, right? So what we created here was UI manager, connect input was the input we used. So you just have to make sure you use that as your key and then pass in our input field. So now we're getting the validation of our input. Should be good to go. Let's see what happens. So I'll just pass in like a big man here. Let's see. So we're connecting, server's actually not on. So let's make sure the server's on and start over again. All right, so we'll call it a big man, connect, and it couldn't find the player manager. Oh, it couldn't find our prefab on the player manager. So before we start this and before we go here, we're gonna need to add the player manager here. So let's do player manager. Let's add our component on here, add our prefab in there, and then create the prefab with our manager, right? It's kind of straightforward. Let's do that. And we need one on here too. So let's do player manager on our server. We're gonna add the player manager script that we have. There we go, player prefab. Here we go, and add it to our prefabs. Okay, now let's save that, start, and go here and start, and let's see. So we got big man for real. So connect. Okay, we got big man for real local, so he pretty much connected instantly. And here we have big man for real 1. There we go. We have connected successfully between a server and a client. So that was relatively, simple and straightforward. It just took a lot of, preparation and beating around the bush to get to where we wanted. But we finally got to a place where you can input a username. It sends the username to the server, validates that, it was a real request, and sends it back. There's no real validation at this point, but there's definitely a space open, and we're getting, the prefabs created on the client and the server. In the next video, we are going to be taking that a step further and going to a new scene when we log in. We're going to have our main menu screen with a button that lets us do the matchmaking. When you click matchmaking, it's going to put you in a lobby with another person, which we're going to have to be as well. And if you're not another person, it's going to, just wait until you find one, right? Just very simple, straightforward matchmaking system, nothing crazy. If you want to keep practicing with this tutorial, just subscribe to the channel. I'll keep releasing new ones regularly. It'll be added to the playlist. You'll be able to see it. Join the Discord. We can talk about this. We can talk about the direction of where this is going. And I'm always down for input. I'm always down for, criticism, creative, constructive, whatever you have. Anything's good. Just let me know, and I'll see you next time.